January 18th, 1983, 02:41 hours. Near Mukachevo, Western Ukrainian SSR. Snow pressed against the concrete walls of the Soviet air defense bunker like a living thing. Inside, the air smelled of ozone, cigarette smoke, and overheated electronics. Fluorescent lights hummed above rows of radar scopes, their green circles sweeping again and again across the darkened map of Eastern Europe. Captain Yuri Mikhailovich Sokolov, Soviet Air Defense Forces, PVO Strany, stood behind the operators with his hands clasped behind his back. He had been awake for 26 hours. His greatcoat was draped over a chair, his uniform collar undone, his eyes fixed on the primary radar display tied to P-14 Tall King early warning arrays stretching across the western border. Nothing unusual. That was the problem. At 02:41, a junior sergeant broke protocol and spoke without permission. "Comrade Captain, we've lost it again." Sokolov leaned forward. "Lost what, Sergeant?" The young man swallowed. His fingers hovered above the scope as if afraid to touch it. "The contact. It appeared at bearing 270, range 180 kilometers. Then it vanished." Sokolov stared at the screen. Empty sweep. Clean sky. "Equipment malfunction?" he asked, already knowing the answer. "No, Comrade Captain. Backup radar confirmed the echo for 12 seconds. 12 seconds. That was enough to kill a city." Sokolov turned toward the communications desk. "Bring up S-200 Vega battery status, all sites." Switches clicked. Telephones rang. Somewhere deeper in the bunker, a diesel generator coughed and steadied. On the wall map, red pins marked missile regiments, long-range interceptors designed to swat American bombers from the stratosphere. Bombers. That was what the system was built for. B-52s, FB-111s, high and loud and glowing on radar like bonfires. What had just brushed their screens left no trail, no speed profile, no altitude lock, and it was moving west to east. Sokolov felt a prickle at the base of his spine. "Request data from P-18 spoon rest low-altitude radar," he ordered. The reply came quickly, and it made the room go quiet. Negative contact. Someone cursed softly. Lieutenant Oleg Kuznetsov, the political officer, stepped closer. "Captain, perhaps NATO is testing electronic countermeasures again, psychological pressure." Sokolov didn't answer. He remembered the briefings from Moscow, classified documents passed hand to hand, never spoken aloud. American cruise missiles, terrain following, radar-absorbing coatings. Weapons that didn't fly like aircraft. Weapons that behaved like ghosts. At 02:51, another blip appeared, this time farther south over the Carpathian foothills. It flickered once, then vanished before tracking data could stabilize. Multiple vectors, low altitude, possibly under 100 meters. 100 meters. Below the engagement envelope of most Soviet air defenses. Sokolov slammed his fist on the console. "Scramble MiG-23 MLD interceptors, immediate readiness." "Comrade Captain," the radar chief said carefully, "we have no continuous track." Sokolov rounded on him. "Then scramble them anyway. You think Moscow will accept we couldn't see it?" The phones lit up. Airfields across the region stirred. Pilots were dragged from bunks, engines preheated in the freezing night. Somewhere on a runway, a MiG's turbines began to scream. But even as Soviet fighters clawed into the darkness, the radar room descended into controlled chaos. Contacts appeared, then dissolved. Range estimates contradicted each other. Speed readings made no sense. Too slow for jets, too fast for helicopters. "This is impossible," someone whispered. Sokolov said nothing. His mind replayed the unthinkable scenario every Soviet officer feared but never voiced. A nuclear decapitation strike that gave no warning. Cruise missiles were not supposed to be invisible. Not like this. At 02:51, a call came in from a neighboring sector, Lvov Air Defense District. Their voice was tight, professional, terrified. "We are observing the same phenomena. At least 6 low-altitude penetrations, no radar lock, no visual confirmation." 6. Sokolov felt his mouth dry. This was no exercise. The political officer cleared his throat. "Captain, perhaps we should escalate to General Staff." Sokolov looked at the blank radar sweep, the green lines circling endlessly over nothing. If this was an American strike simulation, Moscow needed to know. If it wasn't, he reached for the secure line. "Report to Moscow. Tell them Soviet airspace has been penetrated by unidentified low-absorbable targets." There was a pause on the other end. Then a single question came back. "Are you certain?" Sokolov watched another contact flash into existence, directly over a critical rail junction, then vanish. He answered quietly, "Yes." Above the bunker, the snow continued to fall, and somewhere below the clouds, something the Soviet Union had no name for slipped silently through the night. 03:07 hours. The secure line to Moscow went dead with a dull click, leaving only the hum of electronics and the faint scratching of radar pens across plotting boards. Captain Sokolov did not move. Around him, officers waited, frozen between orders and disbelief. Outside the bunker, MiG-23s roared into the black sky, their afterburners briefly painting the snowfields orange. Inside, the radar screens remained stubbornly empty. Lieutenant Kuznetsov broke the silence. "If these are American cruise missiles," he said carefully, "they must have been launched from NATO airspace hours ago." Sokolov nodded once. "Or from the Black Sea." That possibility hung in the air like poison. Soviet intelligence had warned of the BGM-109 Tomahawk, a weapon still spoken of in rumors and grainy satellite photographs. Small wings, a turbofan engine, guidance systems that hugged terrain like a predator stalking prey. Weapons designed to slip beneath the great shield of Soviet air defense. The PVO doctrine, built over decades, was suddenly showing cracks. At 03:12, a technician shouted, "Visual report, Border Guard Post 417. All eyes turned. "Unidentified object observed at treetop level, no navigation lights, audible but faint, described as buzzing, like a chainsaw." A chainsaw. Not the thunder of bombers, not the scream of jet engines. Something smaller, quieter. Sokolov felt the room tilt. Track direction. East-northeast, speed estimated at 800 kilometers per hour. Too slow for a jet, too fast for anything else. Activate S-125 Neva batteries, optical targeting only. The Neva missile crews obeyed, swinging their launchers toward empty sky, relying on human eyes and scopes instead of radar returns. Searchlights cut white spears through the darkness, but they found nothing. At 03:18, the first MiG pilot called in. "This is Falcon 1. No contacts. Radar useless below 200 meters. I have ground clutter everywhere." Sokolov closed his eyes briefly. The Soviet interceptor fleet had been designed to fight high-altitude intruders. Against this, whatever this was, they were blind hunters chasing echoes. Another call cut through, this time from a communications hub near Ivano-Frankivsk.
"Comrade Captain, we have lost power." "How?" Sokolov demanded. "Transformers destroyed. Explosion. No warning." The room erupted in voices. Sokolov silenced them with a raised hand. Explosion. Precision. No radar track beforehand. It matched the nightmare scenario briefed only to senior commanders. Conventional cruise missile strikes to cripple command and control before a nuclear exchange. Lieutenant Kuznetsov's face had gone pale. "Captain, this resembles a decapitation rehearsal." Sokolov didn't disagree. At 03:24, Moscow called back. This time, the voice belonged to Colonel General Anatoly Kirsanov, Central PVO Command. "Comrade Sokolov, you will maintain observation and avoid escalation. Do not launch without confirmation." "Comrade General," replied Sokolov, choosing each word, "we have confirmation of explosions on Soviet territory." A pause. "Are you suggesting hostile action?" "I am suggesting that something is already inside our defenses." The line crackled. Somewhere far away, decisions were being weighed that could end the world. "Continue monitoring," Kirsanov said finally. "We are comparing reports from Poland, East Germany, and the Baltic districts." That was worse. This wasn't isolated. It was systematic. At 03:31, radar picked up something new. Not a contact, but an absence. A corridor where radar noise behaved strangely, as if the air itself had been disturbed. An engineer leaned closer. "Possible terrain masking pattern. Repeating." Sokolov stared at the map. The corridor pointed toward a major fuel depot used by the Carpathian military district. "Predict impact," he said. Hands flew across calculators and plotting tools. 3 minutes, someone whispered. Sokolov imagined the missile, low, steady, guided by stored maps and inertial systems, indifferent to Soviet doctrine or ideology. A machine following instructions written years earlier, now unstoppable. At 03:34, the lights flickered. A distant concussion rolled through the bunker, dull but unmistakable. Dust fell from the ceiling. "Fuel depot hit," came the report seconds later. "Secondary explosions ongoing." No sirens, no warning, no radar lock. Lieutenant Kuznetsov crossed himself before remembering where he was. For the first time since the Great Patriotic War, Soviet air defense officers were facing an enemy that did not announce itself, did not challenge them openly, and did not appear on their sacred radar screens. Sokolov removed his cap and ran his hair through his hair. "This," he said quietly, to no one in particular, "is what defeat feels like before it happens." Above ground, fires burned in the snow. Below ground, the guardians of Soviet airspace realized they were guarding an empty sky.
03:49 a.m. The bunker no longer felt secure. Every vibration in the concrete floor made officers glance upward as if expecting the ceiling to peel away. The great advantage of Soviet air defense, early warning, had evaporated. What remained was uncertainty. Captain Sokolov stood over the operations table as new reports flooded in. A railway signal hub near Stry destroyed. A communications relay outside Kolomia knocked offline. All precision strikes, all low altitude, all invisible until impact. No civilian areas, no mass casualties. This was not terror. It was demonstration. Pattern analysis confirms military infrastructure only, the intelligence lieutenant reported. No random targeting. Sokolov understood immediately. The message was being written in explosions. We can reach you whenever we choose. At 03:53, an unexpected contact appeared, not on radar, but on a pilot's canopy.
Falcon 2 here, the MiG-23 pilot said, breathing hard. I saw it, visual only. The room snapped to attention. Describe, Sokolov ordered. It's small, gray, wings swept back, flying below ridgeline, no exhaust flame. It didn't react to me at all. Did you engage? I tried, the pilot replied. By the time my seeker head stabilized, it was gone, like it knew I was there. It didn't know. It didn't care. The cruise missile was not fighting the MiG. It was following terrain contours loaded into its guidance system, valleys, rivers, power lines. The pilot might as well have been chasing a map. Sokolov felt a grim admiration he immediately suppressed. At 0401, Colonel General Kirsanov called again. We have confirmation, the general said. Multiple low-observable cruise missiles have penetrated Warsaw Pact airspace, likely launched from NATO aircraft over the North Sea and Mediterranean. Sokolov waited. This is not an attack. It is a test, a warning. A warning, Sokolov echoed. Yes, and it has succeeded. In Moscow, analysts were reaching the same conclusion Sokolov had reached hours earlier. The Soviet air defense system, radar pickets, interceptor belts, missile rings had been built for a war that no longer existed. Cruise missiles didn't challenge airspace, they ignored it. At 0408, a final strike hit, this time against an empty airfield. No aircraft destroyed, just a crater in the runway and shattered concrete. A signature. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, the intrusion stopped. Radar screens returned to normal. No more flickers, no more phantom corridors. Silence. MiG pilots circled uselessly until ordered home. Missile crews stood down, their weapons never having fired a shot. In the bunker, no one celebrated. They were too busy understanding what had happened. Sokolov sank into a chair. His hands trembled slightly now that the crisis had passed. Lieutenant Kuznetsov spoke in a low voice. "Comrade Captain, how do we report this?" Sokolov looked at the wall map, now marked with red grease pencil circles where impacts had occurred. "We report the truth," he said, "that the enemy no longer needs to fight us in the air." At 0421, Moscow issued classified instructions. All data from the night was to be sealed under top secret, special importance. No mention in the press, no acknowledgement to the public. Officially, nothing had happened. Unofficially, an era had ended. In the weeks that followed, Soviet design bureaus would scramble to respond. New radars, over-the-horizon systems, faster processors. But even as engineers worked, the officers who had been there that night understood something deeper. Speed no longer guaranteed survival. Altitude no longer meant safety, and radar, once the all-seeing eye, could be deceived. Captain Yuri Sokolov would never forget the moment the sky went empty and the explosions began. Years later, after the Soviet Union itself had vanished, he would tell a younger officer a single sentence about that night. Sokolov said, "We didn't lose a battle, we lost certainty." Because on a frozen January night in 1983, Soviet air defense officers learned the most terrifying lesson of modern warfare. The enemy no longer had to be seen to strike. 0612 a.m. Dawn crept over the Carpathian Mountains, revealing smoke columns rising from snow-covered forests and rail yards. From the air, the damage looked modest, no flattened cities, no mass destruction, but every crater marked a nerve struck with surgical precision. Inside the Mukachevo bunker, Captain Sokolov remained at his post. No one had slept. Coffee sat untouched, gone cold in metal cups. The night shift blended into morning, but the weight in the room only grew heavier.
A courier arrived from Moscow with sealed envelopes, red stripes, wax stamps, no signatures. Orders. All radar tapes were to be confiscated, all radio logs duplicated and sent to Central Command, all personnel sworn under renewed secrecy oaths. The Soviet system was closing ranks, not to prepare for retaliation, but to contain humiliation. Sokolov skimmed the directive, then handed it back. Begin compliance. As officers moved, a young radar technician hesitated. Comrade Captain, if they can do this now, what happens in a real war? Sokolov met his eyes. He did not soften the answer. Then the war begins after we are already bleeding. By mid-morning, delegations from NIIDAR and Almaz, the crown jewels of Soviet radar and missile research, were about to be shown something deeply uncomfortable, that their equations had been outpaced by reality. At 10:40, a closed-door briefing began via secure video link. On the screen appeared grainy NATO satellite images, intercepted through intelligence channels, showing cruise missile flight paths reconstructed after the fact. They were horrifyingly elegant. The missiles flowed through valleys, hugged riverbeds, skirted radar lobes by meters. Where detection was unavoidable, electronic countermeasures smeared returns just long enough to confuse operators. One general muttered, "They studied us." No one disagreed. This was not brute force, it was intimacy. The Americans knew Soviet radar frequencies, reaction times, command hierarchies. They knew which officers would hesitate, which procedures required confirmation, which decisions took minutes instead of seconds. They had designed weapons to exploit those pauses. Colonel General Kirsanov addressed the room. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed exhaustion. Comrades, understand this clearly. The purpose of last night was not destruction, it was education. A bitter chuckle escaped someone before they could stop it. Yes, Kirsanov continued, and we have been educated. Sokolov sat back, arms crossed. The lesson was clear to him now. Soviet air defense had been built as a wall. Cruise missiles flowed like water. You could not stop water with walls alone. At 1300, the final assessment came down. PVO effectiveness against low absorbable cruise missiles, unacceptable. A single word, stamped in red ink, unacceptable. For the first time since Sputnik, the Soviet Union was not confident it could defend its own heartland. That evening, as Sokolov finally stepped outside, the cold air hit him like a blow. Snow crunched under his boots. The sky was clear, innocent, almost mocking. He looked up instinctively, searching for something he knew he would never see. No contrails, no bombers, no warning, just empty blue. In NATO headquarters, thousands of kilometers away, analysts were already writing their conclusions. Deterrence had shifted, not because of nuclear numbers, but because of certainty. If one side could strike command nodes, fuel depots, and communications invisibly, then escalation itself became unstable. Fear now lived in the gaps between radar sweeps. For Captain Yuri Sokolov, the meaning was personal. He had dedicated his life to watching the sky, believing vigilance was enough. That belief died quietly on January 18, 1983. The sky had not betrayed him. Technology had. And the war that followed, cold, silent, and invisible, would never again be fought on terms the Soviet Union fully controlled. January 19th, 1983. Moscow, Central PVO Headquarters. The conference room was windowless by design. Thick concrete, steel doors, no clocks. Time, like certainty, was considered a liability here. Captain Yuri Sokolov sat among men whose uniforms carried decades of authority. Generals, chief designers, intelligence colonels. No one spoke casually. Every sentence was weighed, filtered, and stripped of emotion before being allowed into the air. A massive map of the Soviet Union filled the far wall. Red grease pencil marks traced the previous night's intrusions. From the Baltic approaches to the Carpathians, the lines told a story no one wanted to read aloud. General Viktor Belyakov, deputy commander of PVO, finally broke the silence. "Comrades," he said, "last night our air defense system performed exactly as it was designed to perform." That statement caused a stir. "Which," Belyakov continued, "is the problem?" He turned toward the engineers from Almaz, the bureau responsible for the S-75, S-125, and S-200 missile systems. Men who were once heroes of Soviet science now avoided eye contact. "Our system," Belyakov said, tapping the map with a pointer, "was built to defeat bombers, high altitude, high speed, predictable." He paused. "Our Americans have removed altitude from the equation, and with it, our advantage." An intelligence officer stood and activated a projector. Grainy reconstructions filled the wall. Cruise missile silhouettes, terrain profiles, radar coverage cones. "These weapons," the officer said, "do not penetrate airspace in the traditional sense. They infiltrate it." Sokolov felt a chill. That single word, infiltrate, belonged to counterintelligence, not air defense. One of the designers spoke defensively. "Our radars meet all required specifications. The fault lies in deployment density." Belyakov's reply was immediate and brutal. "You are suggesting we place a radar behind every tree." Silence. The truth was unavoidable now. Even a perfect radar network could be overwhelmed by systems that exploited physics, geography, and time. Cruise missiles didn't sprint. They waited. They waited for terrain. They waited for blind zones. They waited for human hesitation. At 11:30, the discussion turned to retaliation, not military, but conceptual. How do we restore deterrence when the enemy believes we cannot see the first blow? No one answered, because deterrence depended on belief, and belief had cracked. Sokolov realized something then that went beyond tactics or technology. The Cold War had always been about visible power, parades, missile silos, bomber fleets. Cruise missiles were invisible power, and invisible power terrified planners far more than visible threats. That afternoon, a classified directive was drafted. Its language was clinical, but its implications were historic. Immediate acceleration of low-altitude detection programs, development of over-the-horizon radar, integration of automated command systems to reduce human delay. Translation: we are behind. By evening, Sokolov was dismissed. As he left the building, he passed younger officers speaking in hushed tones, not about ideology, not about NATO aggression, but about whether the Soviet Union could still protect itself. That night, alone in his Moscow apartment, Sokolov replayed the sounds of the bunker in his head. The hum of screens, the sudden reports of explosions without warning. He understood now that fear had changed shape.
In 1941, fear came with engines and sirens. In 1962, fear came with missiles on parade. In 1983, fear came silently, flying low, guided by maps and mathematics. And once fear became permanent, the sky no longer needed to be crowded to be dangerous. It only needed to be empty.
Spring 1984. Kaluga Oblast, outside Moscow. The forest had been cleared in a wide arc, weaving behind mud, scaffolding, and skeletal towers rising from the earth. Captain Yuri Sokolov stood with a group of officers and engineers as massive antenna arrays were slowly hoisted into position. This was Duga 3, over-the-horizon radar. Officially, it was for early warning against ballistic missiles. Unofficially, everyone present knew why it had been rushed forward: to see what could not be seen. The January night had changed priorities across the Soviet military-industrial complex. Funding that once flowed predictably now surged toward anything promising low-altitude detection, passive sensors, acoustic arrays, infrared experiments. Some worked, many didn't. None offered certainty. An Almaz engineer gestured toward the towering structure. "This system listens for disturbances beyond the horizon," he explained. "It does not rely on reflection alone." Sokolov nodded, though he understood the subtext. Reflection, the very principle of radar, had been betrayed. As months passed, Soviet exercises grew quieter. No more bomber formations screaming across radar scopes. Instead, war games focused on reaction time, data fusion, and automation. Human hesitation was now considered a vulnerability. In classified classrooms, young officers studied diagrams of American cruise missiles. They memorized silhouettes, engine sounds, expected behaviors. But the most important lesson wasn't technical. It was psychological. "You will not see the enemy," instructors told them. "You will feel him through missing data, disrupted systems, sudden loss." Sokolov lectured once at the academy. He spoke without slides. "The worst moment," he told the cadets, "is not when something appears on your screen. It is when nothing does, and something still explodes." Years passed. The Cold War ground on, quieter but more brittle. Each side refined ways to blind, confuse, and bypass the other rather than confront it directly. Then, in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. There were no cruise missiles that night, no explosions, just paperwork, speeches, and lowered flags. Sokolov watched it all from retirement, the January night of 1983 never far from his thoughts. He saw years later footage from 1991's Operation Desert Storm, American cruise missiles slipping through Iraqi defenses, striking targets with the same eerie precision. The world finally noticed what Soviet air defense officers had learned in silence years earlier. The future of war was not loud. It was surgical, unannounced, and devastatingly calm. On his last visit to Mukachevo, now in a different country, Sokolov stood outside the old bunker. The doors were rusted shut, weeds pushed through cracked concrete. He looked up at the sky one final time. Still empty, still quiet, but no longer innocent. Because once weapons learned how to disappear, the age of warning ended forever.